It is 7 o'clock. Are you ready, Duane?
I'm ready to go.
Okay. So start out this evening, as always, saying thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you, Duane, for leading this. Please remember, everybody, that you can make donations to not only support this program, but also support the Vandenbushe Education Scholarship for a local student to help them go to college. You can make those donations by going to CrestedButteMuseum.com. You'll find a donations tab up at the top of our homepage. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, so if you miss tonight's or you have some sort of technical issue with tonight's webinar, or you've missed some others, you can go to CrestedButteMuseum.com. They are all located, all the links to all the past webinars are located there on the homepage. Just scroll down a little bit and look in the left-hand column to find all those recordings. Please consider becoming a member of the museum. Memberships go towards not only preserving our fantastic historic building, but also supporting programming like this. It also helps us take care of our over 18,000 items in our collections. And members get all kinds of benefits, including 10% off in the store, sometimes free entry to events, or at least discounted entry to events. And you all are the first ones to hear about everything we're doing. We're still doing walking tours. Our historic walking tours take place every morning, Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m. and then every Saturday at 3 p.m. You can also schedule private walking tours. So if you're not in town or you're visiting later, we do private walking tours for groups of 3 or more. We are doing closed captioning for this recording once again tonight. It's been pretty funny to see some of the words that our closed captioning technology has come up with, but so far it seems to have been doing pretty good. Finally, I want to let you guys all know about 2 great films that are showing at this year's film festival, the Crested Butte Film Festival. The first one is High Country by Red Lady Films. The second is Born from Junk by Buttery Agency. Both include interviews with Duane and many more historians. High Country is all about the mid-timers, those that came in the 60s and the 70s, and how they created the town that we know today. And Born from Junk is all about the invention of mountain biking and where that got started. They're both fantastic, great directors and producers that we all know here at the museum pretty well. So be sure to go to the Crested Butte Film Festival website in order to get your tickets for that. And we are doing trivia a little bit later today. We're doing trivia after Duane's presentation. All right, Duane, take it away.
Thank you, Nell, and thanks to everybody for being on board. We got about 400 people registered right now. And as Nell mentioned, the trivia questions, there'll be 2 of them. It'll be after the presentation. Now, we got 2 prizes tonight. One is a great book that I was very privileged to read before it came out by a couple of great friends of mine, Richard Grary and Kara Grary. It's called The Spaghetti Gang. And it's about growing up in Crested Butte, I think from 1931 to 45. That's going to be prize number 1. And prize number 2, Phyllis Grary, Rich's wife, and Kara, the daughter, have written a kid's book called Mill Creek. And the kids count to 10. Kids count to 10. That'll be the second prize. And we'll ask a couple of questions at the end of the presentation. Now, this week on Tuesday, we had one of the great storms in September in the history of the Gunnison Country, and my lawn looks like a war has occurred with trees down all over the place. And a lot of people had that same problem. The power just went on after 3 nights today, and I'm happy to have it on. Remind me of the days I was growing up in Upper Michigan without a little electricity. So in view of that, I am going to cover the history of skiing in the Gunnison Country and a little bit of Colorado next week. That'll be next week's topic because we got all the snow. It's still on the ground. And two items before we get started today. Number 1, Bruce Bartleson has put on Facebook the great storm we had in September 2nd and 3rd, 1961, when several feet of snow fell right on the Labor Day weekend. And, at that time, the railroad had been taken out. Railroad tracks had been torn up. Automobile traffic was nil because the passes were all closed because of the storm. Planes, obviously, we had a small airport at that time. No, there were no air traffic. So 200 stranded people had to be housed in Chapito Hall. And here we go again in September, this time on September the 8th and the 9th, with about 12 inches of snow falling and 18 up at Monarch, and one of the really great storms, very heavy, wet snow that broke off a lot of branches and took down a lot of trees. And one more thing, tomorrow will be September the 11th. And everybody remembers what happened with the Twin Towers in New York in 2001. But for us in the Gunnison Country, we remember September the 11th, 1971, when a bus carrying football players from Gunnison Junior High, junior varsity, went off the road after it lost its brakes on top of Monarch Pass and crashed at Garfield. 8 young men were killed and 1 coach killed, and that was the start of safety features on buses in the United States. So that, that day will never be forgotten in the Gunnison Country. Today, we're going to look at water in Colorado and the American West. We talk about water. Water is absolutely the most important thing in the West, and the second place thing would need a telescope to see it. And there's a great book written about the Colorado River Compact by Norris Hundley, Water and the West. John Wesley Powell in 1877 said, "The history of the American West will be determined by acre-feet of water." Zebulon Pike, exploring the southern reaches of the newly bought Louisiana Purchase territory in 1806 and 7, declared that much of it was a near desert. Stephen Long, during his 1819 and 20 expedition in the West, referred to the area he had been through as the Great American Desert. And that kind of colored the impressions of that area for a long time thereafter. In 1877, the great John Wesley Powell wrote a great analysis of the American West entitled Arid Regions of the West. And there is Powell, the first man to go down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Powell understood the West better than any man ever before him, and probably better than anybody after him. And he made the following points. And there's a caricature of him in Marble Canyon on his trip through the Colorado River in 1869. Here are the points that John Wesley Powell made in his Arid Regions of the West in 1877. Number 1, he said, there is not plenty more where that came from. And he became one of the first conservationists of the West and declared that the nation had to take care of its water and its land and its timber. All of those things were valuable in the West, and we had to take care of them. Number 2, he said, much of the land in the American West was not suitable for farming because of the lack of water. Number 3, he said, if one does farm, you better have access to irrigation. Number 4, he said, ranching is the natural way of making a living in much of the West. Millions of buffalo had existed on the tall grass of the Great Plains, and cattle could do the same. Number 5, the Homestead Act, he said, of 1862, which gave 160 acres of federal land for farming, didn't work in the arid area of Colorado or the West. And finally, he said, there was only one agency able to build gigantic irrigation and reclamation projects necessary for success in Colorado and the West, and that was the federal government. And John Wesley Powell became the father of federal or government bureaus designed to do exactly that. The Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Soil Conservation Service, Bureau of Mines, Forest Service, Park Service, and the United States Geological Survey. Walter Prescott Webb, a young professor, University of Texas, 1922, read Emerson Huff's book, The Way West, in which Huff said the West had been settled by the rifle, the horse, the axe, and the boat. And Walter Prescott Webb knew that it may have been settled by the rifle and the horse, but it sure as hell wasn't settled by the axe and the boat. because there was no timber on the Great Plains and there were no navigable rivers out on the Great Plains. And Webb would write a great book to counteract that, and it was called The Great Plains, one of the great books of the American West. In that book, he said that anybody using the same farming techniques that they had used east of the Mississippi River, try to use them west of the Mississippi, was doomed to failure because there wasn't any timber out there and there wasn't much water and the wind blew on an average of 10 to 12 miles an hour. Wallace Stegner, later in a great book called Beyond the 100th Meridian, echoed the views of Webb. Today, Los Angeles has a local water supply capable of supporting 8% of its population, San Diego 10%, Denver 20%, and Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Lubbock, and other many western and Colorado cities a lot less. The state of Colorado averages 11 inches of rain a year, and that is often overlooked because of the tremendous amount of water that runs off the mountains in the spring. The western slope, the western 1/3 of the state, has 10% of the state's population, 33% of the land area, and produces 70% of all the water in the state. And therein lie many tales of woe. The water is where the people ain't. Whiskey, they say, is for drinking. Water's for fighting. The South Platte River, too thick to drink, too thin to plow. And another statement, water is the most cussed and discussed topic in the West. And then ex-Governor John Love, who said, water runs uphill towards money. 40 million people in 7 states rely on Colorado River water, and the same depend on it for electricity. There are 10 dams and 80 diversions on the Colorado River, which no longer makes it to the Gulf of California and the Pacific Ocean. Early irrigation in Colorado began around the year 1 at Mesa Verde between Durango and Cortez in southwestern Colorado. And from 1 to 1300, the Indians or Native Americans of that area irrigated the top of the mesa, terraced the ravines down to the valley floor below, and had reservoirs and irrigation ditches on the valley floor. They left the southwestern part of Colorado and the Four Corners area because of a 27-year drought from 1271 to 1299. Early Mexican farming ditches ran from streams to the bottomlands nearby in southern Colorado in the 1840s and 50s. The San Luis Ditch is the oldest in Colorado and dates back to 1851. Other early ditches came at Hardscrabble Creek near Florence, Fountain Creek, Greenhorn Creek near Rye, and Conejos Creek. They were all small affairs and used by retired mountain men or Mexican farmers. In 1861, just after the Colorado Gold Rush, David Wall irrigated 2 acres of land near Golden and found that crops he raised were tremendous. Wall made good money selling that produce to the mining camps up Clear Creek Canyon, like Central City and Georgetown. In 1870, Nathan Meeker, with the backing of fellow newspaper man Horace Greeley, began the Union Colony where Greeley is today. With more men to work collectively, Meeker dug canals from the Platte and Poudre rivers and now got water farther away from the bottomlands. Water was taken from the river to bench lands, irrigating more land than ever before. With more and more water taken out of streams, early settlers found that especially later in the year, there wasn't enough water for irrigation. And this would lead to pumping of water from underground aquifers, the most famous of which was the Ogallala Aquifer, which included eastern Colorado and much of Kansas and Nebraska and adjoining states. That aquifer covered 174,000 square miles and contains as much water as Lake Huron, one of the Great Lakes. The windmill, taking advantage of the prairie winds, which averaged 10 to 12 miles an hour, made the pumping from those underground aquifers possible. Later on, gas-powered pumps allowed for much more water to be pumped from the aquifer. leading to over $20 billion of food being produced. Unfortunately, as time went on, aquifers began to get depleted and the water table dropped alarmingly. Aquifers in eastern Colorado and the Great Plains shrank twice as fast from 2011 to 16 as in the previous 60 years. And once an aquifer is depleted, it takes a long time to recover. And around the world, aquifers are in trouble. With water at a premium, Kansas and other Great Plains states came up with an idea, the Great Canal of Kansas. This canal would pump Missouri River water 300 miles uphill to arid regions in the West. The estimated cost of $20 billion and the cost of energy to do it coming in at $500 million a year has quashed that idea for the moment. By 1900, the Uncompahgre Valley on Colorado's western slope, with Montrose in the middle, was going dry, and ranchers and farmers were leaving. There wasn't enough water in the Uncompahgre River. 175,000 acres in the valley, and only enough water for 35,000. And there's a good picture of David Wood's wagon train crossing the Uncompahgre River, which is a trickle later in the year. And you can see in the background that there's a lot of sagebrush and a few trees, but not very much land has been irrigated. All of this led to the newly formed Bureau of Reclamation to engage in its first great reclamation project, the building of the 6-mile-long Gunnison Tunnel, the Uncompahgre Project. The tunnel was driven under Vernal Mesa and diverted Gunnison River water in the Black Canyon into the Uncompahgre Valley. Hundreds of men worked from River Portal in the canyon and Luwani or West Portal, 8 miles from Montrose. The construction of the tunnel went on from 1904 to 1909. Now there is a picture of a pickup truck going through the tunnel, which originally had wood on top. It's now been encased in cement, and going from the area around Montrose 6 miles into the river, Gunnison River in the canyon. Now I've been through there twice, once illegally and once legally, and that's the time that I went through illegally with the ditch rider. Hundreds of men worked from the River Portal and Luwani. That tunnel construction went on for 5 years, and when crews met in the middle, they were less than an inch off. Water running through the Gunnison Tunnel saved the ranchers and farmers of the valley and marked a new era in reclamation of the West. And there you see a picture of the celebration of the Gunnison Tunnel opening in 1909, and that is in Montrose. And that's the next picture will be President Taft, and President Taft is now throwing the switch. September 23rd, 1909, he's at Luwani in the West Portal, throwing the switch to start that water flowing to irrigate the Uncompahgre Valley. The Uncompahgre Project led to a series of trans-mountain water diversions. As more and more people coming into Denver and the Front Range after World War I, the Bureau of Reclamation decided it was time to divert water from the western slope where most of the water was through the Continental Divide and bring it to the growing eastern slope. And that led to those diversions. The first big one was the Moffat Tunnel, taking water from the Fraser River in Middle Park on the western slope and running it through a 6-mile tunnel paralleling Amtrak's railroad tunnel of today. The water wound up being used by growing Denver. In 1937, the granddaddy of them all, the Colorado Big Thompson Project was begun. Work would go on until 1953 because World War II intervened. This Bureau of Reclamation project cost $160 million, and it diverted Colorado River water at Grand Lake and took it underneath Rocky Mountain National Park on the 13.3-mile-long Alva Adams Tunnel, dumped it out into Lake Estes, from there to the Big Thompson River, and from there for irrigation in some of the towns around Loveland and Longmont and Windsor. Of the 500,000 acre-feet of water diverted from western Colorado to the eastern slope, Colorado Big T has the right to divert 310,000 acre-feet of water every year. And a little definition. An acre-foot of water is 1 foot of water covering 1 acre. The Roberts Tunnel was another trans-mountain water diversion. That tunnel was built from 1958 to 62. It dammed up the Blue River and created Lake Dillon near Silverthorne on the western slope. From there, a 23-mile-long underground tunnel was constructed, and water was taken to a branch of the South Platte River near Grant off Highway 285. One more major diversion was the Frying Pan, Arkansas project, built from 1962 to 74. That one took water from the Frying Pan River near Basalt, created the Rudai Reservoir for western slope use near the town of Basalt, and then drove a 6-mile Boosted Tunnel underneath the Continental Divide, with water going into Turquoise Lake near Leadville and then down the Arkansas River. There are 38 trans-mountain water diversions today, carrying 500,000 acre-feet of water from the western slope to the eastern slope. Water was the lifeblood of Colorado in the West and was recognized as that very early. And as population began to increase and water became limited, Western states fought each other for it by litigation. The first major court case was Kansas versus Colorado, which went before the Supreme Court in 1901 and wasn't decided until 1907. This involved the Arkansas River. Much of Kansas used the doctrine of riparian water rights. This water right says that anybody living on a river had the right to use the water as it passed by his or her property, with 2 exceptions. One, you couldn't take so much out of the river that you stopped steamboats from operating, or number 2, you couldn't take so much out that you stopped mill wheels from operating. Well, when we're talking about steamboats and mill wheels, we are talking about tremendous rivers like the Mississippi or the Missouri, where you had plenty of water and nobody worried if you took a little out as it went by your property. Riparian rights became the water right used east of the Mississippi River, where you had plenty of water. That didn't work out in the West. Colorado and other Western states used the doctrine of prior appropriation, the doctrine for an arid land. It had 2 rules. Number 1, first in time, first in use. Whoever had the earliest water rights had the best water rights, and everybody else on the river in a dry year would go dry, and they would be the last ones to go dry. And the second rule was use it or lose it. Nobody can hoard water in an arid land. And if you couldn't prove you could use the water, you had to give it up to somebody who could. This was the water right, the doctrine of prior appropriation, for west of the Mississippi River. In this court case, Kansas versus Colorado, the Arkansas River heads off Fremont Pass, 11 miles above Leadville, and Kansas invoked riparian rights and demanded an end to all water diversions in Colorado, which they said deprived them of water downstream. Colorado declared before the court that it had the right of international law, that it controlled all rivers heading in the state, such as the Arkansas. Colorado also told the court that while Kansas was arguing Colorado was taking water out of the river and they couldn't get it downstream, they were doing the same damn thing to the people in Arkansas, taking water out of the Arkansas River in Kansas and depriving people in Arkansas downstream of the water. And on top of that, Kansas also used prior appropriation in the drier or western part of the state. The Supreme Court ruled in Colorado's favor, saying that Kansas had not been harmed. But ominously, it also came up with an equitable apportionment doctrine, which implied that it didn't make any difference where rivers headed. Everyone on the river had a right to a share. And that was a body blow to Colorado's international law. This case took 6 years, cost a lot of money, and neither side got what it wanted. Further litigation, however, seemed to be the only way to solve disputes among Western states involving water. However, it would take one more Supreme Court case to show Western states that lawsuits were not the way to go. And that case was Wyoming versus Colorado, 1911 to 1922. Took 11 years to decide it. In this case, Colorado wanted to divert water from the Laramie River Basin and river, the Laramie River heading in Wyoming, and they wanted to take it from the Laramie Basin into the Poudre Basin near Fort Collins as the population began to increase there. This plan would have moved water from one basin into another and would have eliminated what we call the return flow. Return flow means that if you're diverting water in the same basin, one spot in the basin to another spot in the basin, 50% of that water is going to go back into the stream. The other 50% is going to be used for irrigation or evaporates. This case, unlike Kansas versus Colorado, involved two states with the same water right. Both sides used prior appropriation. The Supreme Court ruling in 1922 made the following points. Number one, water could be taken or diverted from one basin to another, but only if the basin getting the water had prior appropriation water rights. And the court showed that Colorado or the Poudre Basin only had the rights to 15,500 acre-feet of the Laramie River. And that wasn't enough to build a tunnel to divert it. This case took 11 years, cost more money, and again settled nothing. Colorado and Western states were now convinced that litigation was not the solution to their water problems. And they were also very worried because by 1922, the federal government was claiming all unappropriated water in the West's unnavigable streams. An interstate treaty would have to be the answer. The 7 states involved with the Colorado River and its tributaries would have to agree amongst themselves who got what. During the hot summer of 1922 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, representatives of the 7 states gathered with Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover to divide the waters of the Colorado River. And Colorado was very lucky to have as its representative Delph Carpenter of Greeley, one of the top water lawyers in the nation. A lot of the other states sent politicians. Carpenter knew what he was talking about when he talked about water. Delph Carpenter was alarmed at the fast growth of California, which he thought might claim so much of the Colorado River because of prior appropriation that there wouldn't be anything left for upstream states like Colorado. Carpenter demanded that the Colorado River Compact give upper basin states on the river a share of its flow, regardless of whether the states had yet put it to beneficial use. And the compact would do exactly that. And it set up what we call today the law of the river. And that was a big end around the doctrine of prior appropriation. The Colorado River Compact, studied all over the world by foreign nations, and probably the most famous water compact ever, made the following points. Number one, it said, the 7 states on the Colorado River would be divided into upper basin and lower basin, with the dividing line at Lee's Ferry near Page in northern Arizona. The lower basin states would be California, Nevada, and Arizona. The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Lee's Ferry is where a Mormon missionary, Jason Lee, used to ferry people across the Colorado River. Number two, it was assumed that the Colorado River produced 20 million acre-feet of water a year. Scientific studies had indicated that that figure was high, but politics now got in the way and that point stood, 20 million acre-feet. Number three, the length of the compact would be in perpetuity, and that means forever. And that was put in especially because of Delph Carpenter, who smartly did not want the federal government or lower basin states ever to be able to change it. Number 4, the upper basin states agreed to allow an average of 7.5 million acre feet of water to go by Lee's Ferry every year to the lower basin. Now that, they would also get, the upper basin would also get 7.5 million. So that's 15 million. And if you got 20 million acre feet a year, you got 5 million acre feet in reserve. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Number 5, any excess water would go to the area of greatest need. And no one in his right mind in 1922 could ever envision the growth of Arizona and Nevada. And there wouldn't be 9 people living in Las Vegas or 300 living in Phoenix, except for an invention in the early 1960s called air conditioning. Number 6, navigation and power would be secondary to domestic and agricultural use. And finally, number 7, Mexico, also on the Colorado River, would get 1.5 million acre feet of water a year to be taken equally from the upper and lower basin share. Now, the upper basin was hurt by the compact because since 1922, only 14 million acre feet of water has come from the Colorado River. So the upper basin share is only going to be 6.5 million. It promised 7.5 to the lower basin. So it only gets 6.5, and that equals 14 million. The upper basin was further hurt because the area of greatest need since 1922 has been in the lower basin states. That's where a lot of the population has gone to. 36 million people in California alone. The Colorado River is the most important river in the United States, even though it is only 6th in acre feet of water produced. It is the most important because it is the only real source of water in the Southwest. In the Upper Colorado River Basin Act of 1948, the upper basin states decided amongst themselves who would get what from the Colorado River. Colorado got 51.75%. That's where most of the water comes from. Utah, 23%, Wyoming, 14%, and New Mexico, 11%. And one more thing. In a famous court case of 1908, Winters versus the U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans had water rights on their reservations. Just because the Colorado River Compact ignored that, didn't eliminate their rights. By the 1950s, it was obvious there was a great need for storage of water in the upper basin, so it could deliver water to the lower basin when needed later in the year. The upper basin also wanted storage of water for itself, and this would lead to the Upper Colorado River Storage Act of 1956, led through Congress by Western Slope Congressman from Palisade and head of the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, Wayne Aspinall. Now, I got to know Wayne Aspinall real well because he took part in our water workshops in the 1970s and early 80s. And Aspinall was a very smart man. One time, Phil Burton, a Democratic congressman from California, said to the paper, "You got to, Aspinall, run such a tight committee that you have to raise your damn hand to go to the bathroom." At 8 o'clock the next morning, Burton's phone rang, and it was Aspinall on the phone. He said, "Phil, I need to see you in my office ASAP." Burton came to Aspinall's office, and Aspinall said, "I just read the article in the paper, Phil. Is it true?" And Burton said, "Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is, but I was just kidding." And when Aspinall said, "Phil, you got a river and harbor bill you want out in your district in San Diego, don't you?" And Phil Burton said, "Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do." And Wayne Aspinall said, "Do I make myself clear?" And Phil Burton understood. No more wise-ass comments to the newspapers. The Upper Colorado River Storage Act called for the building of 6 dams in the upper basin states. Navajo Dam on the San Juan River. There's the Glen Canyon Dam. That's one of them. Glen Canyon, San Juan, Colorado rivers. Flaming Gorge on the Green, Glen Canyon. And then 3 dams on the Gunnison River, Blue Mesa, Mora Point, and Crystal. Now, in honor of Bruce Bartleson, who a lot of other people skate out there in the Black Canyon, the next photographs are going to show skating on the Gunnison River in the Black Canyon, which is sensational. And there's one not far from Chipeta Falls. And that one's right near the Kirikati Needle. And there is the Morro Point. And Morro Point is spilling. It was built in 1976, and very rarely does it spill, but it's spilling out of 2 out of the 4 openings. In 1984, there was so much water, it went over the top of the dam, which they don't like to have happen. The Upper Colorado River Storage Act also called for the construction projects in the Upper Basin, such as the Paonia Reservoir, the Crawford Reservoir, and the Ridgway Reservoir. And now a few comments in conclusion about water in Colorado and the West. The water situation in Colorado and the West is dire today in 2020. The Colorado River is over-appropriated, and there simply is not enough water to support the 40 million people who depend on it. There's my buddy Bruce Bartles and his wife Deirdre ice skating on Lake San Cristobal at Lake City about 4 or 5 years ago. Mountain snowpack in the West has declined 15% in the last 20 years, and Colorado river flows are down 20% along with the depletion of aquifers, all due a lot to climate change. Fights over water in Colorado and the West today involve industry, agriculture, recreation, cities, environmentalists, power companies, the federal government, and developers. We must accept the fact that we live in an arid land and act accordingly today. And the day is fast approaching where we may see the Eastern movement, where people have to leave Colorado and the West and move to the east where the water is. President Gerald Ford once declared in Mountaineer Bowl, honoring Wayne Aspinall, that education, they say, costs a lot, but ignorance costs a lot more. The only thing that stops growth and more population in Colorado is economics. When water bills rise to thousands of dollars a month, that'll stop growth. Many would like to live in Aspen or Jackson Hole today, but with the average price of a house around $2 million, they can't afford it. And that's going to happen with water, when water rates go up to where they probably need to be. The western slope where the water is, and the eastern slope which wants it, will continue to fight each other. The western slope view of the Front Range and the eastern slope in any negotiation is, we believe that their tact is, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. In a court case, Audubon Society versus LA a number of years ago, the public trust doctrine was stated, and that would give the public some rights involving rivers, in direct contradiction to the doctrine of prior appropriation. The major problem regarding water, however, is climate change. The National Research Council said recently that the Earth is the hottest it has been in 400 years. And I'm quoting now, climate change and soaring population across the Southwest threatens to overwhelm the main water source for millions. The Colorado Basin is going to face costly, controversial, and unavoidable trade-off choices, along with demands threatening the area's ability to cope with droughts and water shortages. So, water, the lifeblood of Colorado, and not enough of it. What does the future hold? And that's it on water. Now we're going to get Nell back on here. We're going to go to the trivia questions. Couple of trivia questions coming up, and I'm going to give trivia question number 1. And Nell, how do they answer again?
All right. If you have an answer to the trivia question, throw it in the chat. As long as you get it in the chat box, whether it's to all panelists or all panelists and attendees, we'll take it. So that means if you guys see the answer, that you may not have been the first one in because you won't see all the responses necessarily. So here we go. In the chat box.
Question number 1. What president threw the switch to start the water flowing into the Uncompahgre Valley in 1909?
Woo! We got some answers really quickly on that one.
Who's first?
Number 1, Jen Hildebrandt with Taft.
Okay, that's good. She's got it. Now she gets the spaghetti gang. We'll get her information. Question number 2. What are the 2 water doctrines used in the American West and east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi River? 2 water doctrines used in the U.S.
All right, let's see. We've got Loretta Clark. She answered just appropriation. Frank Stern answered riparian and prior appropriation.
She's got it.
All right.
Got that name down.
Frank Stern.
And any questions? I'll take one from Mark Walker. Mark, yes, I read your article on the Crested Butte paper. I'm looking forward to the second one, and thank you for the kind words, and thank you for doing all the work you did back then. Mark's question is, tell about the role of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Gothic in regard to the issues of climate change. And it is great because what they have done with plants and animals, and especially a guy like Billy Barr taking the snow readings and moisture readings, they are one of the leaders in determining that climate change exists and is serious. Any other questions?
We got a question in the Q&A from Greg Salisbury. Colorado now has 5.8 million people, with about a third of those folks arriving in the last decade and 92% of them locating in the Front Range. They will want water. Where will it most likely come from, and how will it impact Western Colorado?
Well, I'll give Greg the answer to that question. When you have all those people coming into Colorado, you don't manufacture water. And what's got to have happen is that water rates go up to a level to where people can't come in. Because when they come in, they turn on the tap, they want water. But if it's $20,000 a month, they're not going to be able to afford it. The $64 question is, if that doesn't happen, where's the water going to come from? I have absolutely no idea, because unless you take water out of agriculture, which is where most of it is used, and dry up a lot of areas like they've dried up South Park, you don't have the water to support those people. We live in an arid area. We got to recognize that. And sooner or later, the due date will come. But that's a great question.
Next, we've got a question from Thomas. What was the change in capacity that the Gunnison Tunnel brought to the Uncompahgre Valley?
Well, it saved the Uncompahgre Valley because of being able to irrigate 35,000 acres of ground. They now irrigate over 100,000 acres of ground. And they've got 250 miles of ditches, laterals, and canals. And it's just fantastic. It is the first great Bureau of Reclamation project in history, and one of the most successful. So everything was based upon the success of that.
Jen asks, does cloud seeding affect water amounts / spring runoff?
Yes, it does. The studies indicate that it does, but it's very controversial, because if you seed the clouds in one area for snow, then what happens to the clouds that contain that moisture as they go east? So that's going to be the scene of probably a lot of court battles as time goes on. But we're not exactly sure, exactly how much good that does, but we know it does some.
Tristan asks, do you think that the water situation will get bad enough that one of the states in the compact will break it? And what will happen if they do?
Well, that's why Delph Carpenter put in perpetuity in. Short of a catastrophe and the U.S. Congress trying to break that, Supreme Court would have to rule on it. It can't be changed, and that's why Carpenter put in perpetuity.
Ian asks, will some dams have to be demolished due to sediment buildup in reservoirs and thus reduced storage capacity? If so, how will this affect water storage in the West?
Okay, say that again, Nell.
Will some dams have to be demolished due to sediment buildup in the reservoirs and thus reduce storage capacity? If so, how will this affect water storage in the West?
Yeah, there's no doubt that they will have to be eliminated because of silt. And how many, we don't know how long that will be in the future, but anybody who's seen the Paonia Reservoir and all the mud that comes in on that one knows that all dams years are numbered. Now, what happens after that, obviously, is a $64 question.
Kent and Sue ask, what are the City of Gunnison water rights and how does it allow for the expansion of the Gunnison Rising, adding 1,700 homes?
Yeah, the Gunnison water rights are very good. They date way back. So Gunnison right now has ample water rights, and Dick Bratton's involved with Gunnison Rising. He's one of the top water lawyers in the West, and I think they have adequate water there for 1,700 people. Now, a little controversy over whether or not you ought to have 1,700 additional people, but I think they have the water rights, and the ones in Gunnison are very good.
All right. Martin asks, please, can you talk about what it's like to be a ditch rider?
Well, a ditch rider, I know Glenn Phillips. I knew Glenn Phillips, and now I met Randy Phillips. It's hard work. And I had a great article in the Gunnison magazine summer edition when they talk about the ranchers and their hired hands going in and riding on these ditches, and you got hip boots on. A lot of times the water's going to go over your hip boots, and you're taking out all kinds of debris to make sure that the ditch is able to function and the water flow. Now, a ditch rider, the work is hard today, but I guarantee you it's not as hard as the people who dug the ditches initially using all kinds of primitive equipment. And what they did is remarkable because they had to be great engineers to know how much those ditches would drop per 100 yards or so.
Jan asks, will you be writing a follow-up to your A Land Alone, Colorado's Western Slope?
Down the line, I'm 83 years old, so I got to live long enough. But I'm thinking about that, yes.
Let's see, from Kathy, if they can run a pipeline for oil, why not a pipeline from hurricane areas?
The problem with that is they've thought about it from the Great Lakes, and they thought about it from the Missouri River. And I can guarantee you that states along the Great Lakes aren't wild about it, and states along the Missouri River aren't wild about it. And on top of that, it takes enough energy to do that and so much money to do that it probably isn't feasible.
Dominic asks, have you ever seen it smoky and snow in a day before this week?
No. And Sonia Chavez, who's Upper Colorado River Conservancy, says they think cloud seeding generates 5 to 15% more water. Thank you, Sonia.
Mm-hmm. And then Dominic says Paonia was all dried up. Is that for the fire?
Yeah, Paonia usually dries up later in the year. And this year, of course, has been a very, very bad one in terms of moisture this summer and also how hot it's been. So that's not unusual. I've seen that happen probably 30 or 40% of the time.
All right. Any more questions? Okay.
That's great. I thank you, everybody. Anybody else want to get on the chat book? You know, Mark asked, what do you say to those who deny climate change? Now, you know, a little bit of a controversial issue, but for me, I believe in science. And the scientists say, and I think it is pretty obvious around the world and in the Arctic and into all of the, you know, just how warm the earth has become, that it exists. And we better pay attention to it.